Dr. Jayne Engle is an adjunct professor at McGill University and holds a PhD in urban planning, policy, and design. She's passionate about bridging transformative community action on the ground with policy and systems change, particularly in ways that foster freedom and the flourishing of people. She lives in Montreal and is excited to be working on a new collaborative book project called Sacred Civics, exploring how to value differently what matters now. She leads the Cities and Places portfolio at the McConnell Foundation, where her team has built an ecosystemic approach to inclusive urban innovation. Dr. Jayne Engle will be speaking to us today about the future of urban policy. Dr. Engle, the forum is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and I am so delighted to have been invited by the students group to be here, and it is called the Policy Disruptors series, so I will be intentionally disruptive and intentionally provocative. So it's radical imagination for future fit urban policy. And I'd like to, first of all, acknowledge as well that I'm welcoming you here from an island known in Mohawk language as Tiohtià:ke. And as we know, Indigenous peoples have been caretakers of lands and waters here for thousands of years. So I'd like to welcome all of you from wherever you're joining in from. So what I'll speak about today builds on work of many others, but I also want to say that I take personal responsibility for what I say. The views are not necessarily those of the organization where I work. So speaking of that, the McConnell Foundation. So we are a philanthropic foundation where I lead a portfolio which has already been described: Cities for People, Civic-Indigenous 7.0, Participatory Canada, Emergence Room, Future Cities Canada, a number of initiatives. And we have, as a foundation, we've helped to build a culture of social innovation as well as social finance and tools associated with that over the past decade. And we focus our grant partnerships on transition to a net zero equitable economy, on community well-being, and on Indigenous reconciliation. And my talk today will be in 3 parts. So first, let's imagine some possibilities. Second, what conditions can we imagine for future fit policy? And then third is I'll share some ideas, experiments, and projects which are underway. So I'd like to start with some of my own biases and motivations that drive this thinking. So the first one is the scale of crises, right? We know about COVID, we know about climate, misinformation, inequality, et cetera. One that I feel doesn't get talked about enough is the crisis of imagination. And I feel like it's one of the reasons why too many of the changes we make, including policy changes, are incremental fixes as opposed to structural change. So that's first thing. Second thing is my own personal journey of reconciliation. I've learned and am learning a tremendous amount, making mistakes along the way. But I'm also conscious as a city planner that reconciliation is not manifest in our cities. And now's the time for it. And when I speak about reconciliation, I'm talking about relationships. So nation to nation relationships, also relationships between peoples, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and also our relationship with the land, including the land in cities. And a third thing is big tech. And that's big tech in the realm of city building. So many of you will know that a Google sister company, Sidewalk Labs, was one of the largest ambitions yet of big tech to create a whole city neighborhood in Toronto that was initiated a few years ago. So the project raised so many issues relevant for the future of civic innovation, democracy, tech, and so on. And many of you will also know that the project actually got canceled last spring. So it's not moving forward, but it did raise so many important things for us to consider collectively as a society, let alone governments. And it really raised for me in my own consciousness, what is at stake in our city building. Also, the meaning of smart cities, how essential it is to value what matters, to revere what is sacred in cities, in people, and in nature, including agency, legitimacy, ideas such as the commons, equality, and so on, and all of the implications that, that have flowed from the experience. So with those, sort of biases and things that I hold as I look at things, let's imagine. So to the point of this cartoon, let's see imagination as a necessity and not a luxury. So the amazing speculative fiction writer, Octavia Butler, she wrote Afrofuturist novels, and this was 30 years ago, where she foresaw a US that was ravaged by inequality, by climate disaster, greedy politicians who appealed to racists and put walls around the wealthy. So she had wise foresight. She saw how problems would grow into full-fledged disasters that we're seeing now. And that is really the kind of foresight wisdom that we need to bring to our imagination, because there's a lot of current conventional economic, spatial modeling practices and so on, which actually don't comprise as well the wise foresight that we need now. And that requires not only things like speculative fiction and imagination, it requires participatory futures. So people have to engage and people have to be invited to imagine alternative futures. Something we like to talk about are 7-generation cities, which really means looking back and looking forward 7 generations and transcending what are current city-making paradigms. So it's really about holding the question of, are we building physical, digital, social infrastructure so that children in 7 generations will thrive in equitable and regenerative cities? We need to hold ourselves accountable to that. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to take you into a little bit of imagination space, and I invite you to sort of let go of your critical policy minds for a moment and open to dwelling mind so that you can see and listen and suspend judgment. So you might recognize that this is Wakanda. I love Black Panther, not least for the city building in it. This was great because it helps us to imagine and question how we build cities. The transport systems, the density, the technologies, et cetera, really provoke imagination. That's Hollywood nonetheless. I'd really like to talk about retrofitting cities. So very often climate action plans talk about retrofitting buildings, but we actually need to be thinking about retrofitting streets and neighborhoods and cities. And 7-generation thinking helps us do that by looking back as well as forward. So this example here, I don't know if people recognize this city or not, but this is a vision of San Francisco as an eco-city. You might recognize the skyline. And this is work by Richard Register, who's both an artist and an eco-city theorist. He's the founder of Eco-City Builders. This is the cover of his book, Eco-Cities, Rebuilding Cities in Balance with Nature. And what I really appreciate about his work, even though he's quite unorthodox, so lots of people haven't heard of him, but what he did is he brought to light how we could think about imagining cities over time, developing as eco-cities. And he also quite helpfully constructed the policy and development mechanisms around that would enable it at the city scale. So his first book was Eco-City Berkeley, where he goes through a process like that. More work, which I find absolutely riveting and really important, is this work called Mannahatta. And it's by Eric Sanderson. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's far less known than it should be. And in fact, I think it would be great to do this in other places. In fact, I tried to do a project like this when I was working in the neighborhood on a sustainability plan in the neighborhood right next to McGill, called Milton Park. We tried to map out the former ecosystems of the neighborhood and then think about how the neighborhood could be retrofit over time that would be more reflective of the underlying ecosystems. So what's interesting about this is, well, many things. One is the landscape on the left, of course, is Manhattan in about 1609. So Manhattan was incredibly diverse. It had 55 ecosystems. It had vast forests, otter, beavers, mink, bears. And this work is about not only understanding what existed before, but also what it does is it's not about saying we need to bulldoze all of Manhattan, of course, that exists on the right, but what it does mean is we can take into consideration in development patterns and in policy patterns over time, what are the underlying ecosystems and how do they matter and how can we develop differently in the course of time so that we are building more in balance with nature. So this kind of work and this kind of thinking requires far more than city planners, and it requires far more than engineers and scientists. It also means speculative fiction writers and artists are together in the policy development, I would argue. Just wanted to give a couple of examples of two books that inform this. One is Design with Nature, which is this book by Ian McCarg. It's an old book, but this book actually set the foundations for what is now geographic information systems. So that was really looking back and building cities based on the underlying ecosystems. But then also, this is a wonderful book I'm reading by the great speculative fiction writer, N.K. Jemisin, The City We Became, which is about speculative fiction, it primarily in modern New York. Okay, so I'd like to move now back to this century, but let's go 45 years in the future to 2067. So there's a new exhibit, which is at Montreal's Biosphere, and it's also featured in Azure magazine, where they invited designers and architects to imagine Montreal in 2067. So different designers came up with different ideas, such as this one, which is creation of a consciousness park within the St. Lawrence River. This is a massive marsh built along the river to filter all of the city's wastewater. And then alongside that, it would be about planting orchards and vegetable gardens, etc. This is about removing cars from an entire borough of the city. It happens to be the plateau where I live. So I would love to see this happen sooner than 45 years from now. But it would mean that space would become a truly public space. And this is poetic rewilding of the oil refinery. Some of you may recognize this, although it's hard to recognize it, but the oil refinery in the eastern part of the city. And I have to be honest with you that for me, a lot of these I hope will happen sooner than 2067 and much more at scale. So I think there's a real opportunity for imagining and prototyping some of these kinds of visions sooner rather than later. So there's lots that's achievable in the shorter term if there's public and political will. So I want to turn now to a few spatial urban frameworks, such as 15-minute cities, which are relevant right now and in the works right now. So the 15-minute city came out of Paris. So Mayor Anne Hidalgo was elected last year on a platform of building the 15-minute city. And interestingly, it was far less interesting to voters before COVID. After COVID happened, this platform became very popular. She won the election last spring, and now this is the plan. And 15-minute city is about giving all residents access to key services and amenities for life within a 15-minute walk or bike ride of their homes. And then complementary to that is something called the 1-minute city. So this was developed by Dan Hill. He's with Vinnova, the Swedish innovation agency, many others, primarily in Sweden initially. It focuses on the immediate streetscape outside of one's home. So it's about exploring models to co-design, care for, and maintain the street and public space collectively to shift cultures and systems about things like gardening and biodiversity and mobility, play, neighborhood life, etc. Closer to here, this is in Toronto. It's a proposal for a major retrofit in downtown Toronto called University Park. It's what we call a civic commons project that would build a park extending in a biodiversity corridor all the way from the center of the city to the waterfront. Our partners Evergreen are involved in this, and I'm really excited to see whether they can build momentum to make it happen. And then here's a vision for a street retrofit. It's called Green Block. It's in New York City's Flatiron District by WATG Architects. So as I mentioned, building retrofits are important, yes, and that's what most people talk about when they talk about climate action plans at the city level, but we really need to be thinking bigger. We need to be thinking about retrofitting our neighborhoods and our cities, and we need to think in terms of 7-generation cities to fuel our imaginative capabilities about that. So part of that is also Indigenous imaginings of future cities. So I'm working closely with a colleague, Tanya Chomtiam-Fook. She's with Future Cities Canada. She's also a co-editor with me on this book project, Sacred Civics, that was mentioned in the beginning. So she talks of an Indigenous reimagining of cities that are regenerative, co-creative, interconnected, and exploring ways of placekeeping and also nature-inspired innovation that look at what humanizes us and restores our connection to the spirit of place. So it's about caretaking actions and ecosystems that give life to cities and nourish us. And another outstanding leader in this space is Ginger Gosnell-Myers. She's with the city of Vancouver and also at Simon Fraser University. She's an Indigenous city planner and part of a growing movement to reflect Indigenous culture in cities. So the work is really about co-creating cities and urban identity that connect everyone through Indigenous knowledge to the land that we share. And as she says, this is really what respectful and meaningful reconciliation can be. So I'd like to turn now to the second part, which is what are conditions for future fit policy? What are the foundations we need for some of the policy that I've talked about earlier? So as you know, we're seeing so many failures in systems and institutions. And given that many of the dominant logics and legacy lock-ins of our economic system, it's not surprising. I love this quote by Jacinda Ardern, who of course is one of the leaders of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which I'll speak about a little bit later. So I want to argue that there are 4 accountabilities that have to be built into governments and institutions and systems in order to be fit for the future. So these are the 4. First one is accountability to future generations. And some of you may know already, I did not until recently, that at the origins of democracy, rights of future generations were actually enshrined. Unfortunately, that commitment fell away in the past several hundred years. And as you know, we're very often handcuffed really by a hegemony of short-termism. So if we're to be accountable to generations who aren't yet born, we actually need long-termism in our policy, in our funding, in investment decisions, and we need new forms of engagement. So at the city level, that might mean civic assemblies that have representation for future peoples, et cetera. So another accountability is to the earth. You know, it's interesting that we consider it normal that constitutions and legal systems acknowledge rights of people and of corporations, but not rights of nature. And Indigenous governments are an exception to this, where law is a verb and people are considered responsible to law together, and it's a sacred responsibility of that in stewardship of nature. So being in relationship with the earth and accountability to healthy ecosystems is really necessary if we're to stop biodiversity loss and discontinue exceeding other kinds of planetary boundaries. Third is to the designed world. So let's reimagine our relationships with objects we make, with buildings, construction materials, products, plastics, electronics, and so on, addressing product life cycle, externalities, et cetera. Building an economy that becomes circular is really critical. And then accountability to all people. So currently, governments answer to a subset of people. In liberal democracies, that's primarily voters and interest groups. Others have little to no say. And I would argue that we also need to begin to be accountable for extraction and externalities that are outside of national borders. So even within our cities and within our country, of course, there are obscene inequalities, but we also impose inequalities in other places through what we do that we don't have in ways that we don't have responsible for. So embedding ethics of local and global solidarity are essential. So we're far from these at the moment. What are just some of the assumptions? And I'm going to name 3 assumptions that we have to consider busting if we're going to truly be able to be accountable in these ways and to build much better futures. So the first one is ownership. And as you know, in many cultures, the right to private ownership, private land ownership, especially, is sacrosanct. Should that be the case in the world we need to create? And how can we think a little bit differently about property and land rights and data rights and privacy, et cetera? Which also begs the question, which Saskia Sassen has drawn us to a lot, which is who owns the city? And if the answer is that we all should, then we probably need to reconceive ownership, because we have cities where land ownership and land and housing even is becoming an asset class of the rich, which is not fair, not only to people now, but not for future generations. So we really need to rethink some of these fundamental assumptions. Second is role of corporations. So what should be the role of corporations in today's world? Should we expect shareholder interest to give way to public interest and common good? What about data, digital rights? How should we own or steward data, and who should get to use which data for which purposes? So many questions. Should we expect smartphones to be good for democracy, to be good for us and our kids? And how importantly could we invent institutional change, or maybe even new institutions in parallel with these technologies as they're developing, that would strengthen democracy and build civic legitimacy instead of continuing to lag? And a third assumption is about sovereignties. And I include this map of Indigenous nations of Turtle Island to help to jar our typical mental models of non-overlapping political boundaries. So there's a great deal of dissonance between sovereignty and solidarity. Take vaccines. In fact, your first speaker in this series, Dr. Peter Singer, just gave a wonderful talk. I so enjoyed that. He spoke brilliantly about the dilemmas of vaccine equity and vaccine diplomacy and so on. And that's at national and transnational level. But also at the city level, jurisdiction issues are often impediments to positive change. So for example, cities, they often lack jurisdiction for critical infrastructure investment that has effects on residents, including into future generations. And a good example of that in Montreal is I'm not sure if it's 5 or 6 billion or so that was spent recently on the Turcotte interchange, highway interchange, which was actually a provincial decision not supported by the city, even though it's in the city, right? So we need to assume that sovereignties and jurisdictions are not forever fixed. As I mentioned in Anishinaabe language, law is a verb and people law together. So what would it mean to manifest that? What would it mean to imagine rivers and forests and other commons having sovereignty? It's happening in a few places of the world, but not very frequently yet. There are some cities in the world, I don't think any in Canada yet, but some cities that have rights of nature statutes, which is one way to think differently about sovereignties and jurisdiction. We really need to be able to question some of these fundamentals if we're to make real change. So on to the last section is some ideas, some experiments and projects which are happening. And I'll speak in three areas: redefining infrastructure, policy as a verb, and building missions. So first, redefining infrastructure. This is some work that you can look up. It's by Dark Matter Labs, Indy Johar and others on his team, as well as Climate Kick in Europe, a climate innovation agency that's supported by the European Commission. So specifically on here, what I want to talk about is natural assets and nature-based solutions. So they've done some work about thinking trees as infrastructure, urban forests as infrastructure, and what would that mean in terms not only of capital investment and of design, but it also actually requires changing accounting rules, because right now these kinds of ecosystem assets are actually liabilities on balance sheets of cities. And there's a whole lot in, what we call the dark matter or the deep code of how these things work that perpetuate the current paradigm, which is actually destructive. So we need to rethink how we think about infrastructure, how we invest in it, how we account for it, et cetera. Next is public space infrastructure, which is critical for the future of civic engagement, for socioeconomic mixing in cities, for environmental sustainability, and so on. This is a project called Reimagining the Civic Commons in the US. 10 cities are involved. The last 5 just came on board in the past year, actually during COVID. Lots of great work going on there. And here is a social infrastructure I wanted to draw your attention to. And we're building this with others, including based on work in London, UK by Participatory City Foundation. So we've partnered with them to actually support prototyping this approach right now in 3 Canadian cities, in Halifax, Montreal, and Toronto. And this on screen is Halifax. And in Halifax, it's Indigenous led, and they've decided to center the work in reconciliation. It's really exciting. The city, the province, civil society are coming together in support of this. And it aims to be a platform which is radically inclusive, that invites the creativity of everyone in creating all sorts of neighborhood projects, collaborative businesses, cooperatives, and so on, that are healthy for people and also good for ecology of the neighborhood. Policy as a verb. The work of John Burroughs, who is he's a Canada Research Chair for Indigenous Law. He actually started the world's first joint degree program at University of Victoria in Indigenous law and common law. And by the way, he's got former students and colleagues in the McGill Law Department, so they'd be great people to collaborate with. He's written lots of books. In this one on screen, Laws Indigenous Ethics, he talks about how to apply the 7 grandmother-grandfather teachings into law. Teachings of love, truth, bravery, humility, honesty, respect, and wisdom. These are qualities that are ennobling of people. And imagine embedding those into our governance. And very quickly, I won't go into detail on this, but this is work that we've done and supported with others, primarily Dark Matter Labs and Mars, also worked with the community of federal regulators, this network of regulatory experimentation. The report's online, but really we were looking at looking differently about how we think about regulation and policy and who is around the table. So this convening for which this document is a report involved not only federal and provincial regulators, but we had Indigenous elders there and activists and civil society and the private sector. So, a very diverse group of people around issues of regulation, which you wouldn't normally think about. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go through these a little bit fast, but we can come back if there are questions. Legitimate Cities is some work that we put together in 2019 with partners, and it happened the same time that not only the Sidewalk Labs project was happening in Toronto, or at least on the drawing board, but also the federal government's Smart Cities Challenge. And what we wanted to do with this work was think about how we could build public trust and civic legitimacy through civic innovation in ways that would also contribute to equality and a culture of experimentation. And could we find ways to support regulatory innovation and experimentation, which are so needed, including at the city level? And how could we do that in ways that would enable much faster adoption of some of the kinds of policy and regulatory changes that are needed? Commons is another really important institutional form. You'll probably know the work of Elinor Ostrom on governing the commons. Well, there are many excellent scholars and practitioners who have brought this work to the city level. Sheila Foster and Christian Ioni have written a number of articles, also books. This drawing is about their work on Ostrom in the city, where they adopt Elinor Ostrom's institutional design principles to the city context. And Michelle Bowens and many others have written about urban commons. What would it look like to think about our cities as commons? And a few cities have even developed quite comprehensive plans to transition towards that. And those are Ghent in Belgium, Seoul in South Korea, and Sydney in Australia. And the last topic is building missions. So we're talking about missions which are multi-sector at multiple scales, and the kinds of societal missions that, can align markets, governments, private sector, civil society, and so on. And one of the major proponents and leaders of this approach is Mariana Mazzucato. And she's leading and she's informed mission work in places around the world. This is her newest book, Mission Economy, which came out recently. It's actually not yet available here, but it will be next month. She argues about how governments and others need to think much bigger and mobilize resources around wicked social problems, as well as climate change, et cetera. And this approach is really gaining traction in a number of places. And I wanted to just point to a few examples here of places that, of ways that missions could be taken up. So on the bottom right is the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. We talked a little bit about that earlier. So something I really love about the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, first of all, at its heart, it's about moving away from only or primarily GDP as a measure of progress of a country to measuring well-being of people and planet. And so at the government level, there are a handful of countries, they all happen to be led by female prime ministers who have signed on to this, and that's New Zealand, Iceland, Wales, Scotland, Finland. And it's also a grassroots movement, and it's very exciting here in Canada. The Alliance is also growing quite rapidly. David Suzuki Foundation and others are leading that charge, but many others are engaged. So we're hoping that Canada might be the first G7 country to sign on. It would be great if you all could help with that. Also, we'll draw your attention in the upper right to Climate Neutral Cities 2030. So I don't know how closely you follow climate goals of cities, but they're not normally this ambitious. So it's 9 cities in Sweden which have signed up to be climate neutral and committed to that even through contracting by 2030, including Stockholm. So this isn't just little cute towns. So that's a mission. That's a great example of a mission they're on. Global Parliament of Mayors is a unique governance I'm not going to go into it now, again, for lack of time. If you don't already know the work of Kate Raworth and Donut Economics, I recommend you look it up. On the bottom left, cities are starting to adopt this approach. So Amsterdam has adopted it. Portland, Philadelphia, and the US are. Actually, California is looking at it as a whole. And in Canada, the first city to commit to it is Nanaimo in British Columbia. And the Emergence Room. So I want to move quickly through this. The Emergence Room is something that we're building with Dark Matter Labs and Mars Discovery District, and in discussion with many, many other partners, because our aim is to create a collaborative space for emergent initiatives that have deep structural transition possibility. And we're focused in 3 ways initially. So one, we're trying to build a platform for societal missions, for multi-sectoral, multi-scalar societal missions. Second is we're building a residency for innovators. And a third thing is that we're thinking with a number of others about what is the institutional infrastructure required for transition innovation that we now need? And how could that be built and financed in ways that are hybrid, that are regionally distributed, and so on? And I'd like to close with this because you are policy leaders of the future. And I invite you, to always keep in mind these wise words of Elinor Ostrom, which she said in her Nobel Prize acceptance speech. A core goal of public policy should be to facilitate the development of institutions that bring out the best in humans. Thank you. And please get in touch if you'd like to learn more. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Engle, for your insightful, very insightful talk. I know we all learned a lot from you. And so now we're going to move into the question and answers period. I'm going to start with the questions that were submitted beforehand, and then we'll add some from the chat. So if you have questions, feel free to add that into the chat. With time limited, we apologize if we can't get to every question, but feel free to still submit your questions in the chat as we progress. Kind of going off of Eleanor's quote that you just shared with us, and knowing that you're passionate about bridging the transformative community action on the ground of policy and systems change, what advice would you give to new policy graduates who are interested in working in the urban planning field? Oh, I think you might be muted.
Thank you. Yeah, well, certainly I would advise, as I just did, lots of imagination. Of course, it's really important, especially early in your career. You have to be technically excellent. You have to be incredibly rigorous, and you also have to be bold and imaginative. So it's really important to be all of those, to be able to defend every argument that you make, to be able to defend it well with a number of different kinds of metrics, quantitative, qualitative. Mm-hmm. So it's so that kind of rigor, but also bring life, bring innovation, bring a life-centered approach, and bring a 7-generation view to it. So institutions are made up of people. And it's hard for institutions to change. One of the things that I've learned the most, including in the last year, is that people tend to be bolder than institutions. And so it's really important for people, for entrepreneurs to work hard and to band together to make change, to create future fit institutions.
Wonderful. Next question that came in, someone asked, and I'm kind of tying it to what you said about building with a balance with nature. How might we redefine and build infrastructure for urban recovery that addresses the reality and the possibilities?
Yeah, well, that's a huge question. So I would say that a few things really to keep in mind. So we have to not automatically reproduce the dominant paradigm, which is what our tendency is. So we have a tendency to continue to invest in roads and bridges and every other kind of infrastructure the same way that we have, to repair it, or even when it needs repaired, to rebuild it in the same way. And we need to be able to question that. So nature-based solutions are a huge part of that. I talked about that earlier, that has to be part of the future of city building, a much bigger part. Also social infrastructure and how we think about social infrastructure. So right now, social infrastructure does include things like affordable housing and things that are also capital investment, like daycare infrastructure and so on. But social infrastructure also has to be the kinds of mechanisms that will help to grow and support community wealth, community health, community resilience, because we have to be able to strengthen the way that we interact and work for everyday life, not only to make our neighborhoods and cities healthier now, but because we can expect increasing disasters into the foreseeable future. So we need stronger resilience at the neighborhood level.
All right, perfect. Someone else was asking, what would be the biggest challenge for Canadian cities?
Well, so, you know, I talked about it as if it's an easy thing, but, you know, retrofitting neighborhoods and, retrofitting cities and redefining infrastructure and investing differently in infrastructure, these are monumentally difficult, but absolutely possible. But it does take a mission-oriented approach, because it has to be governments aligning, it has to be private sector aligning, civil society, capital markets, how we finance, and what we finance has to change. So I would say one thing is these societal mission approaches, I think, are really important. And I would also say that don't only look at the surface kind of change, do look at the dark matter. So policy, great that you're in policy. Policy matters deeply. Policy, regulations, accounting, these things are critically important.
Wonderful, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else had a question about the smart city movement, both short and long term, and you mentioned having long-term plans, not just short-term. With what we're experiencing COVID and kind of shifting what's a priority, what would be, how do you balance having the short and the long-term plans?
Oh man, it's such a paradox. I mean, so many of these things are a paradox. It's a paradox for a number of reasons. One is not least, and I want to acknowledge this, I mean, there is tremendous suffering in cities right now, right? I mean, even cities that were doing great before COVID in their climate action planning, for example, like Vancouver was doing quite well, we're quite bold. Now with the social suffering, with the problems, on the streets every day of Vancouver, it's very hard, and cities tending to those critical human needs, it's very hard to also, look up and think long term, because it feels like a luxury. Mm-hmm. What we have to do is we have to address both, because you can't ignore one or the other, but you have to be building in ways that are changing the systems that actually provided the conditions to put us in the place that we are now as a society. So you have to hold the paradox. One other paradox to mention is that the smart city movement, on the one hand, it has the paradox of both, on the one hand, being somewhat of a threat to democracy and agency of people. On the other hand, it also provides great potential for leveraging tech for climate, ecological good, for equality outcomes. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where cities that are more innovative by certain measures are also more unequal cities. And it should be the opposite. Actually, technology should enable us to be more equal. Instead, we've just come to accept these kinds of norms, which, again, we have to question so many of these patterns that we take as just how things are.
Yes. Someone from the audience is asking, what is the dark matter and what should we look for as signs that tell us a city is doing well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what I was talking about, the dark matter, and also dark matter labs call it, they say they're building the boring revolution. But when we say dark matter, we're talking about, policy, regulation, accounting rules, these kinds of things, but also the kind of legacy lock-ins that again perpetuate dominant paradigms for how we do things. And those are the kinds of things that in the past, too often we haven't questioned. And too much of the changes that we make, if we're not addressing that underlying, deep code or dark matter, it's sort of like window dressing. It's sort of like, you're just kind of rearranging the furniture, but you're not actually, getting rid of the mold, that's in the house. So it really is about the infrastructure that is considered boring because it's less seen, but it is it's critical. Even how we measure things is part of it too. How we measure what's important. What do we consider progress to be? Unpack GDP, unpack everything that is in GDP and then what is not in GDP. Well, if we say GDP is the most important thing for the progress of of our nation, that leaves out so much that is really worth living for. So yeah, that's dark matter.
Wonderful, thank you. Someone else from the audience is asking, when we talk about the sustainable development oxymoron, sustainable being the conversation of things and the development being towards changing them, how do we understand this tension within the concept of cities of the future?
Yeah, I love that question. And it also, for me, gets at the question of growth. And there are lots of discussions about growth and whether it's good or bad and so on. But very often when we say growth, people, and I don't know what came to your mind when I said growth, but for many people, that means GDP. Okay, so what if we thought about growth as increasing well-being of people? Or what if we called growth actually increase of ecosystem health in our city? What if that were growth? So what I would say is what we're calling these things really matters. So don't just say growth, talk about the kind of growth, because hard to say. And, if Chris, feel free to disagree with me on this one, but, there is a lot about our economic system, which has held something central, which is about extraction of nature as quickly as possible with the cheapest possible labor. And, is that really what needs to be central for the world we need to build? I think we need to question some of these assumptions. I'm not saying that's all economics is, but I think that's one part of it.
No disagreement, just for the record, no disagreement.
Okay, awesome.
Lovely. We had another attendee ask, how do we bring the developers, the private sector in while upholding important principles like sustainability and data governance that you had mentioned?
Yeah, I love that question too, because it's so important, and it can be so easy, when you're somewhat lefty like I am and work on, things that are really ambitious. It's like, well, are you actually, is this realistic, or is this something, is private sector going to join in? And it's really interesting because we increasingly, especially, we are having so many great discussions with businesses large and small who have similar thinking. We know that BlackRock is changing its, is even changing its thought about the future. Because companies are realizing, of course, the risk that, and the uncertainty and immense risk that markets face now. We have people like Mark Carney writing a book on value and talking about how, what markets value and what people value have to become aligned. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I wanted to add something else. Markets value. It'll come back.
Sounds good. We have another question that came in. The OECD's well-being indicator uses weighted indices to rank countries based on factors like education, mortality, incomes, and other factors likewise. What would be a good rule of thumb when thinking about measuring well-being?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would say that, and I'm not sure for what scale we're thinking about, but in terms of well-being, so generally it's about well-being of people and planet. So first of all, so it's about, our natural systems and of people. And what New Zealand has done, for example, is they've actually created a well-being budget. So they have, which is kind of an alternative budget, and Chris or others might know more about this, but they've assessed, what a number of factors are. Actually, Scotland has a brilliant, it's called a national performance framework, and I can't remember what all the factors are, but you can look it up on Scotland National Performance Framework, which again is about setting up a well-being budget as well. And I would argue that it needs to take into consideration those accountabilities I mentioned. So it has to be about all people and externalities that we're also pushing to other places. It has to be about future generations. It has to be about creating circular economies. And it has to be about nature and ecosystem services.
Wonderful. We have time for one more question. So this one will be our last one. Juan asks, he says that he works for the Department of Transportation, and they recently changed the maximum speed from 60 to 50 and introduced the 80-kilometer bike lanes and several other projects towards a more walkable city, which might be seen as sacrificing car space, but I'll leave it to the experts to decide that. He says, nevertheless, the public opinion of our department has never been lower. People are reluctant about the changes towards the democratization of public space, and asks, how could we communicate these policies more effectively to persuade those who feel reluctant about change? So to car drivers and motorcyclists.
Oh yeah, great question. And I so empathize with you because I have been a city planner and I know how hard these things are. So one way is that civic assemblies and citizen assemblies should actually comprise what Japan has now enshrined in its municipalities, which are in every meeting, people actually, a certain percentage of people, it might even be half the people, actually adorn robes, and they are invited to be there as representatives of future generations and to make decisions as if they're coming to the present from the future. And by doing that, it radically changes the decisions that are made. So I think we have to invite, we have to inform, we have to engage differently in ways that have people thinking about the true costs of how we live and build now, and what it means, not only in terms of equality for people now and for the environment, but also for the future. So that would be that would certainly be one response. And other than that, stay strong, carry on, don't give up. And also, it's tough to be in a position of constantly responding to public opinion. I know, as a participatory city planner, you're always, or in the role you're in transportation planning, you're always going to have people who disagree with you, just as anytime in a business district or anytime in a downtown you try to take away any parking, it doesn't matter if the place is mostly covered with parking. So often people will claim you're going to kill businesses, that's going to be the end of it, and very often it's quite the opposite. But these kinds of things, even when they're not popular, we have to think about ways to continue to democratize them, but in ways that are well informed. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time with us today, and a big shout out to the participants on the call for your questions and your interest in attending this Policy Disruptors second series. I'm going to invite John back to the screen to provide some concluding remarks, but thank you again, Dr. Engle.
Thank you very much. It was great to be with you.
You as well.
Well, thank you, Ellen, and thank you again, everyone, for having joined us for our second event in this series. It was a pleasure to have all of you participate in this discussion. I'd like to thank again Dr. Jayne Engle for her valuable insights and guidance. To keep up with Dr. Jayne Engle and Cities for the People, please follow her on Twitter. Her Twitter handle is @Jayne Engle, so that's the @ symbol, and then her name, Jayne Engle. This video will be posted at www.ppags, that's PPAGS.ca. You can also visit our website for upcoming events and info on new policy disruptor guests. And before you leave, please take a quick minute to answer the poll that is being posted on the chat. PPAGS thanks all of you once again and wishes you all a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Jayne Engle. It was such a pleasure. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Au revoir.